My name is Sarah, and I'm about to tell you about the night I saved a life and watched someone else take credit for a miracle I created with my own hands. It was 3 months into my first rotation in the neurological ICU at St. Mary's Hospital, and I was still the new girl, still fighting to prove that my nursing degree meant something more than just checking vitals and changing bed sheets. The ICU was a cathedral of suffering, filled with the constant symphony of ventilators breathing for people who couldn't breathe for themselves, monitors beeping their electronic prayers, and the hushed whispers of families clinging to hope in the fluorescent-lit darkness of medical uncertainty. Room 314 housed 17-year-old Alex Peterson, a high school senior who had collapsed during basketball practice 2 weeks earlier and hadn't opened his eyes since. The doctors were baffled. His CT scans showed no trauma, no stroke, no obvious cause for his comatose state. His blood work was normal, his vital signs stable, but his brain seemed locked away somewhere unreachable, leaving his family to maintain a vigil that had stretched from days into weeks. His father, Mr. Peterson, had essentially moved into that room, transforming it into his personal command center where he held court like a medical general directing a war he didn't understand. Mr. Peterson was the kind of man who wore his wealth like armor and his faith like a weapon. He owned 3 car dealerships across the state, served on the hospital board, and made sure everyone knew both facts within minutes of meeting him. His tailored suits never wrinkled despite the long hours he spent in that uncomfortable hospital chair. His silver hair remained perfectly styled even after sleepless nights, and his voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades having his opinions treated as facts. He questioned every medication, challenged every procedure, and treated the nursing staff like servants in his personal kingdom of grief and denial. The night shift was always quieter in the ICU, but room 314 was never truly quiet. Mr. Peterson's voice would carry through the halls as he made phone calls to specialists across the country, his conversations peppered with medical terminology he'd learned from Wikipedia and his absolute certainty that his son needed something more than what our hospital could provide. He'd pace the small room like a caged lion, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the linoleum floor, pausing only to adjust Alex's blanket, or to stare at the monitors as if he could will them to show different numbers through sheer force of determination. I found myself drawn to Alex's case not because of his father's demanding presence, but because something about the boy's condition didn't sit right with me. During my nursing school rotations, I'd seen plenty of unexplained cases, but there was usually some thread to follow, some clue that pointed toward an answer. Alex's case felt different, like a puzzle with missing pieces that everyone had stopped looking for. The neurologist had run every test in their playbook, consulted with colleagues, and ultimately settled into the uncomfortable territory of medical uncertainty, managing his condition while hoping for spontaneous recovery. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something obvious, something hiding in plain sight. I started spending extra time in Alex's room during my shifts, not because Mr. Peterson made me feel welcome there, but because I'd learned to trust my instincts about patients. There's something about being a nurse that trains you to notice the subtle things, the small changes that doctors might miss because they're focused on the big picture. We're the ones who spend hours with patients, who learn their rhythms and recognize when something shifts, even slightly. It was during one of those extended observations that I first noticed the twitch. Alex's left eyelid would contract slightly, not enough to register on any monitor, but visible if you knew where to look. It wasn't random muscle contractions or the normal flickering that sometimes happens in comatose patients. This was rhythmic, almost purposeful, like Morse code tapped out in the language of nerve impulses. I started timing it, counting the intervals, and realized it followed a pattern that repeated every few minutes. The discovery excited me in the way that only nurses understand. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, but it was new information. And new information in a case like Alex's could be the key to everything. I documented it carefully in my notes, describing the frequency, duration, and specific location of the contractions. I even sketched a small diagram showing exactly where I'd observed the movement, because I knew that precision mattered when you were trying to convince doctors to consider a new possibility. My research began that night after my shift ended. Instead of going home to my studio apartment, I found myself in the hospital's medical library, scrolling through databases of neurological conditions and case studies. I pulled up articles about rare movement disorders, atypical seizure presentations, and obscure neurological conditions that might present with comatose states. The deeper I dug, the more convinced I became that Alex's case wasn't as mysterious as everyone thought. The condition I found was called anterior opercular syndrome, an extremely rare neurological disorder that could present with consciousness alterations and subtle motor symptoms that were easy to miss. The medical literature described it as a condition that often went undiagnosed because its symptoms were so subtle and because the diagnostic tests weren't typically ordered unless someone specifically suspected it. The eyelid contractions I'd observed matched the case studies perfectly, and the timing aligned with what the research described as early-stage presentations. I spent hours reading everything I could find about AOS, taking notes on symptoms, treatments, and diagnostic criteria. The more I learned, the more certain I became that this was what we were dealing with. The treatment was relatively simple, a specific medication that could reverse the neurological blockade if administered early enough, but the window for effective intervention was narrow. According to the literature, patients who didn't receive treatment within the first few weeks often suffered permanent neurological damage. Armed with my research, I approached the next day's shift with a mix of excitement and nervousness. I knew I was about to challenge the medical team's assessment of Alex's case, and as the newest nurse in the ICU, I wasn't sure how my theory would be received. But I also knew that Alex's life might depend on someone being willing to look beyond the obvious, to consider possibilities that hadn't yet been explored. The morning rounds were conducted by Dr. Martinez, the chief neurologist, a man whose reputation for brilliance was matched only by his impatience with interruptions. He moved through the ICU like a medical hurricane, dispensing orders and observations with the efficiency of someone who had seen everything and been surprised by nothing. Mr. Peterson always positioned himself prominently during these rounds, ready to pepper Dr. Martinez with questions and suggestions that were usually politely deflected. When the team gathered around Alex's bed, I took a deep breath and stepped forward. My voice felt smaller than usual as I began to explain what I'd observed, describing the eyelid contractions and their rhythmic pattern. Dr. Martinez listened with the kind of polite attention that medical professionals give to nursing staff when they're trying to be encouraging but aren't really expecting anything significant. I had barely finished describing my observations when Mr. Peterson's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Excuse me, nurse," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But I don't think we need speculation from someone who's been working here for 3 months? My son needs medical expertise, not guesswork from a novice who probably spent more time in college learning about bedside manner than actual medicine." The room fell silent in the way that only happens when someone has crossed a line that everyone recognizes but no one wants to acknowledge. "Doctor." Martinez cleared his throat uncomfortably. The other nurses found suddenly urgent reasons to check their charts, and I felt my face flush with the kind of humiliation that burns from the inside out. Mr. Peterson wasn't finished. "Maybe you should focus on making sure his bed linens are clean and his medications are on time, and leave the medical detective work to the people who actually went to medical school." The worst part wasn't the public humiliation, though that stung deeply. The worst part was seeing the dismissive nods from some of the medical team, the way my carefully researched theory was swept aside not because it was wrong, but because I was the wrong person to suggest it. I stood there feeling like every stereotype about young nurses had been draped over my shoulders like a scarlet letter, marking me as presumptuous and naive. Dr. Martinez, to his credit, tried to smooth over the situation with diplomatic professionalism. "We appreciate all input from the nursing staff," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "but we've been very thorough in our diagnostic approach with Alex. We'll continue monitoring his condition and adjusting our treatment plan as needed." It was a polite dismissal wrapped in medical courtesy, but it was a dismissal nonetheless. As the medical team moved on to the next patient, I remained in Alex's room, ostensibly checking his IV lines, but really trying to process what had just happened. Mr. Peterson had returned to his vigil in the bedside chair, his attention focused on his son, as if the confrontation had never occurred. But I could see the satisfaction in his posture, the way he'd reasserted his dominance in the room and put the presumptuous nurse back in her place. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Alex, about the subtle signs his body was giving us, about the narrow window for effective treatment that was closing with each passing day. I thought about my nursing school professors who had drilled into us the importance of patient advocacy, the responsibility we had to speak up when we believed something was wrong, even when it was uncomfortable or politically difficult. I also thought about the oath I'd taken as a nurse, the promise to do no harm and to always prioritize patient welfare above personal comfort. Somewhere in that sleepless night, I realized that my pride had been wounded, but Alex's brain was potentially being damaged by our inaction. The choice became clear in the way that moral choices sometimes do when you strip away all the politics and personal feelings and focus on what really matters. The next evening, I came to work with a plan that could end my career before it really began. I'd researched the medication used to treat anterior opercular syndrome, calculated the appropriate dosage for Alex's weight and condition, and figured out how to obtain it from the pharmacy without raising immediate red flags. The drug was available in our formulary because it was used for other neurological conditions, but administering it without a physician's order was a violation of hospital protocol that could result in immediate termination and possible legal action. I waited until the ICU settled into its late-night rhythm, when the attending physicians had gone home, and the skeleton crew of residents and nurses maintained their quiet vigil over the critical patients. Mr. Peterson had finally succumbed to exhaustion and was dozing in his chair, his perfectly styled hair finally showing signs of the stress he'd been carrying for weeks. Standing in the medication room, I held the vial of medicine in my hands and felt the weight of the decision I was about to make. This wasn't about proving I was right or showing up the medical team that had dismissed me. This was about a 17-year-old boy whose brain might be slowly dying while we all debated protocols and hierarchies. My hands were shaking as I drew the medication into the syringe, and I had to pause several times to steady myself. The walk from the medication room to Alex's bedside felt like a journey across a moral precipice. Each step was a choice to continue down a path that could destroy my career. But each step was also a choice to honor the responsibility I'd accepted when I became a nurse. I thought about all the nurses who had come before me, who had broken rules and challenged authority when patient safety was at stake, who had understood that sometimes being a patient advocate meant being professionally insubordinate. In that moment, humiliated in front of everyone, I had a choice. Back down and let a boy suffer, or break the rules and risk everything. If you've ever felt underestimated but knew you were right, subscribe to Hospital Revenge, because this is where our fight begins. Alex's IV line was easily accessible, and I'd administered thousands of medications through similar lines during my training and brief career. But this injection felt different, weighted with the knowledge that I was crossing a line that separated rule-following nurses from those who were willing to risk everything for their patients. I documented the administration in my notes as an emergency intervention based on observed neurological changes, knowing that the documentation would either vindicate my decision or serve as evidence against me in a disciplinary hearing. With the syringe in my hand, I hesitated. Save the patient and possibly lose my job? Or obey and live with the guilt? It's a choice no one should have to make. Leave a like on this video if you believe patient safety comes before hierarchy, and tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my place? The medication entered Alex's bloodstream silently, invisibly, beginning its work on neurological pathways that had been blocked for weeks. I stood by his bedside for several minutes after the injection, watching his monitors for any immediate changes, listening to his breathing, observing the subtle signs that might indicate whether my theory was correct or whether I had just made a career-ending mistake based on wishful thinking and novice arrogance. Nothing happened immediately, which was actually what I expected based on my research. The medication needed time to work, to cross the blood-brain barrier and begin reversing the neurological dysfunction that had kept Alex unconscious. I completed my shift with a mixture of anticipation and dread, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether I was a hero or a soon-to-be unemployed nurse who had violated basic medical protocols. I was driving home when my phone rang. It was the night charge nurse, and her voice was tight with excitement and confusion. "Sarah, you need to come back. Alex Peterson is awake. I don't understand what happened, but he's awake and asking for water." I turned my car around and drove back to the hospital through the early morning darkness, my heart pounding with a mixture of vindication and terror. The ICU was buzzing with activity when I arrived. Alex's room was crowded with medical staff, all trying to understand how a patient who had been comatose for weeks had suddenly regained consciousness. Mr. Peterson was on his knees beside the bed, his perfectly styled hair finally disheveled, tears streaming down his face as he held his son's hand and whispered prayers of gratitude. Dr. Martinez was running through neurological assessments, his professional demeanor barely containing his amazement at Alex's sudden recovery. The boy was groggy but responsive, answering questions appropriately, and showing no signs of the neurological damage that everyone had feared. His motor functions were intact, his speech was clear, and his cognitive responses suggested that whatever had caused his coma had been completely reversed. "It's a miracle," Mr. Peterson kept saying, his voice breaking with emotion. "God answered our prayers. He brought our boy back to us." He stood up and embraced Dr. Martinez, thanking him repeatedly for his expertise and dedication. "You saved my son's life, doctor. You never gave up on him when everyone else might have." The irony was so thick I could taste it, but I stood in the doorway watching the scene unfold with a strange sense of detachment. The medical team was struggling to understand Alex's recovery, ordering new tests and scans to try to determine what had changed. Dr. Martinez, to his credit, seemed genuinely puzzled by the sudden improvement and was carefully documenting everything in an attempt to understand the mechanism of recovery. But Mr. Peterson had already decided on his explanation, and it had nothing to do with medical intervention and everything to do with divine intervention. "I never stopped believing," he told everyone who would listen. "I knew that if I had enough faith, if I prayed hard enough, God would bring Alex back to us. This is proof that miracles still happen, that faith can move mountains and wake up sleeping minds." He was radiant with joy and religious fervor, attributing his son's recovery to his own spiritual devotion and God's grace. I watched from the periphery as the celebration continued, as Mr. Peterson called relatives and friends to share the news of his son's miraculous recovery. The nursing staff was happy for the family, of course, but there was also a professional curiosity about what had caused such a dramatic turnaround. The medical team was ordering additional tests, trying to understand if there had been some delayed healing process or if they had missed something in their initial assessment. Nobody noticed me standing in the doorway. Nobody thought to ask the night nurse if she had observed anything unusual or if there had been any changes in Alex's condition during the hours before his awakening. I had become invisible again, relegated to the background of a story that was being written by more important people with more impressive credentials. But I wasn't angry. Standing there watching Mr. Peterson praise God for a miracle that I had created with my own hands, I felt something that was deeper and more satisfying than anger. I felt the quiet pride that comes from knowing you've done the right thing, even when no one else knows or cares. I felt the professional satisfaction of a nurse who had trusted her instincts, researched thoroughly, and acted courageously when it mattered most. The revenge I had gotten wasn't the kind that comes with recognition or apologies. It was the kind that comes from knowing that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that nobody else sees. Mr. Peterson would never know that his miracle had been the result of careful observation by a novice nurse who had risked her career to save his son. He would never understand that his dismissive arrogance had nearly cost Alex his chance at recovery. Dr. Martinez would eventually figure out what had happened when he reviewed the medication records and discovered my unauthorized intervention. We would have a conversation about protocol violations and patient safety, about the importance of working within established systems, even when you believe those systems are wrong. I would accept whatever disciplinary action was deemed appropriate, knowing that I had chosen patient welfare over personal safety. But Alex would go home to finish his senior year of high school, would graduate with his class, would go to college and build a life that had been saved by a nurse who had been willing to risk everything for a patient she barely knew. That knowledge would sustain me through whatever professional consequences awaited, because it reminded me why I had become a nurse in the first place. The ICU returned to its normal rhythm over the following days, but room 314 remained a reminder of the night when faith and science had intersected in ways that nobody fully understood. Mr. Peterson continued his vigil until Alex was stable enough to be transferred to a regular room, and then eventually home. He never spoke to me again, never acknowledged my presence during his remaining time in the ICU, but his indifference no longer stung the way it had before. I learned later that Alex made a complete recovery, that the neurological damage everyone had feared never materialized because the treatment had been administered in time. He returned to basketball, earned a scholarship to college, and went on to study medicine himself, inspired by his experience as a patient to pursue a career in healthcare. He never knew that his recovery had been the result of a nurse's insubordination, but he carried with him an appreciation for the subtle signs and careful observations that had saved his life. The case became a teaching moment for the ICU staff, a reminder that recovery could sometimes come from unexpected places and that medical mysteries weren't always as mysterious as they appeared. Dr. Martinez used it as an example of the importance of thorough documentation and careful observation, though he never mentioned the unauthorized intervention that had made Alex's recovery possible. My career survived the incident, partly because Alex's recovery validated my assessment, and partly because Dr. Martinez recognized that my actions, while procedurally wrong, had been motivated by genuine patient advocacy. I received a formal reprimand for violating medication protocols, but I also received quiet recognition from some of the nursing staff who understood the difficult position I had been in and the courage it had taken to act on my convictions. The experience taught me that nursing is often about making difficult choices in impossible situations, about advocating for patients when no one else will, about trusting your instincts even when more experienced people dismiss them. It taught me that sometimes the most important medical interventions happen in the shadows, performed by people who will never receive credit for their actions. Years later, when I became a charge nurse myself, I would tell the story to new graduates who were struggling to find their voice in a hierarchical medical system. I would tell them about the importance of careful observation, thorough research, and the courage to speak up when patient safety was at stake. I would tell them about the satisfaction that comes from knowing you've made a difference, even when no one else knows or cares. But I would also tell them about the weight of responsibility that comes with being a patient advocate, about the professional risks that sometimes accompany moral courage, and about the loneliness that can come from standing up for what you believe is right when everyone else thinks you're wrong. Nursing, I would tell them, is not just about following orders and completing tasks. It's about being the person who notices the subtle signs, who asks the uncomfortable questions, who is willing to risk professional comfort for patient welfare. The night Alex woke up, I went home to my studio apartment and sat in my small kitchen, drinking coffee and thinking about the strange turns that life can take. I thought about Mr. Peterson kneeling beside his son's bed and praising God for a miracle that he would never understand. I thought about the medication vial that had sat in my hands like a choice between safety and courage, between protocol and compassion. I thought about all the nurses who had come before me, who had made similar choices in similar moments, who had risked their careers and their comfort to advocate for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves. I thought about the invisible army of healthcare workers who perform miracles every day without recognition, who save lives and heal wounds and comfort families in ways that never make headlines or inspire gratitude. And I thought about Alex, sleeping peacefully in his hospital bed, his brain finally free from the neurological prison that had held him captive for weeks. He would wake up to a world that believed his recovery was a miracle, and in many ways, it was. But it was the kind of miracle that happens when knowledge meets courage, when careful observation meets decisive action, when someone is willing to risk everything for a patient they barely know. That night, I made peace with being the guardian in the shadows, the nurse whose most important work would never be acknowledged or celebrated. I made peace with the knowledge that my greatest professional victory would also be my most invisible one, that the life I had saved would never be connected to the person who had saved it. The revenge I had gotten against Mr. Peterson's arrogance was not the kind that comes with dramatic confrontations or public vindication. It was the kind that comes from knowing that his dismissive attitude had nearly cost his son his future, that his faith in divine intervention had been validated by the very human intervention he had dismissed. It was the kind of revenge that comes from professional competence quietly triumph over personal arrogance. But more than revenge, it was a reminder of why I had chosen nursing in the first place. It was a reminder that healthcare is ultimately about human connection, about the sacred trust between caregivers and patients, about the responsibility we have to use our knowledge and skills to heal and protect and comfort. It was a reminder that the most important victories are often the ones that nobody else sees, the quiet moments when expertise and compassion combine to change the trajectory of a human life. As I sat in my kitchen that morning, watching the sun rise over the city, I realized that I had found my calling not in the dramatic moments of medical television shows, but in the quiet observations and careful interventions that happen in the margins of healthcare. I had found my purpose in being the nurse who notices the subtle signs, who asks the difficult questions, who is willing to risk personal comfort for patient welfare. The story of Alex Peterson would become part of my professional identity, a reminder of the night when I learned that being a nurse sometimes means being willing to break the rules to honor a higher calling. It would remind me that patient advocacy is not always comfortable or popular, that sometimes the right thing to do is also the most professionally dangerous thing to do. But it would also remind me that the most profound satisfaction comes not from recognition or praise, but from the quiet knowledge that you have used your skills and knowledge to make a difference in someone's life. It would remind me that healthcare is ultimately about human dignity, about the sacred responsibility we have to protect and heal and comfort those who trust us with their most vulnerable moments. The father praised God as his son woke from coma, not knowing that God's help had come through the hands of the nurse he had insulted. But perhaps that was exactly how it was supposed to be. Perhaps the best miracles are the ones that happen through human hands guided by professional knowledge and moral courage. Perhaps the most important healers are the ones who work in the shadows, who save lives without seeking credit, who understand that their greatest victories will often be their most invisible ones. In the end, that night taught me that nursing is not just a profession, It's a calling to be the person who stands guard over the vulnerable, who notices the signs that others miss, who is willing to risk personal comfort for patient welfare. It taught me that the most important medical miracles are not the dramatic ones that make headlines, but the quiet ones that happen when knowledge meets courage, when careful observation meets decisive action, when someone is willing to risk everything for a patient they barely know. And it taught me that sometimes the greatest revenge against arrogance and dismissiveness is not public confrontation or dramatic vindication, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that your competence and compassion have triumphed over ignorance and prejudice. Sometimes the best revenge is being the person who does the right thing, even when no one else knows or cares, even when the credit goes to someone else, even when the miracle you create is attributed to divine intervention rather than human skill. That is the story of how I saved Alex Peterson's life and watched his father thank God for a miracle I had created with my own hands. It's the story of how I learned that being a nurse sometimes means being willing to be the invisible guardian, the silent hero, the person who does the right thing even when no one else knows or cares. It's the story of how I found my calling not in recognition or praise, but in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I had used my knowledge and skills to change the trajectory of a human life. The greatest victories, I learned that night, are often the ones that nobody else sees. The most important miracles are the ones that happen through human hands guided by professional knowledge and moral courage. And sometimes the best revenge is not public vindication, but the private knowledge that your competence and compassion have triumphed over arrogance and ignorance, that you have honored your professional calling even when it meant risking your career, that you have been the guardian angel who worked in the shadows to protect and heal and save. If you made it this far, you understand that the greatest victories are the ones nobody else sees. Leave a like if you believe true strength lies in doing what's right, even when no one recognizes it. Share this story if you know someone who's been underestimated but never gave up fighting for what they believe in. And subscribe to Hospital Revenge, because here we tell the stories of the invisible heroes who save lives behind the scenes of medicine. In the comments, tell me, what was the greatest silent victory of your life?